Morning. I am Gilberto Collazo with Disciples Church Extension Fund. And today I want to spend some time with you on the conversation of reimagining holy spaces, becoming life transforming in changing times. You know, Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities starts with that famous, "It was the best of times and the worst of times." And this phrase could probably characterize many moments in the life of humanity. And certainly it might be something that could really apply to the times that we're living today. Probably many of us thought that at this time we'd be talking about post-pandemic era, and yet here we find ourselves in the middle of a new surge. But truth be told, regardless of what is around us, we as a church are called to be a life-transforming presence in all times, changing times, stagnant times, fluid times. So one of the important places that we need to really consider is when we talk about our holy spaces. Here at DCF, we have kind of coined this phrase or embraced this phrase to really invite us to think about a space which is dynamic and fluid and allows God's people to come together. We know that times like this force us to think and rethink many of our paradigms, many of our assumptions. That's basically what we hope we can do. Start the conversation in the next minutes that we are going to be together. So we invite you into this time of conversation with us. So many churches today struggle with what I would call three valid questions. First question is, how do we get more people into the church? The second question has to do with how do we get more money into our accounts? And the third is, what do we do with the building? And and again, these are valid questions that really require well thought answers and clear strategic plans. But when we think about it, there are two approaches to deal with these three questions. One is a technical approach. The other is an adaptive approach. When we address these questions from a technical approach, what we're basically trying to do is to address the problem that is in front of us, solve it for the moment, with the clear understanding that there might be that problem might come up again. Because usually these problems, a lot of them are cyclical, right? And how they show up in our church experience. But how do we deal with that in the moment? So it's a very reactive solution many times. It deals with that moment, specific moment. And then we just kind of hope for the best. An adaptive approach invites us to look at that situation from a greater perspective, to look at it in a major context, and to look not only at the here and now and at the stopgap solution probably that might fit for the moment, but to begin to look at the bigger picture, to consider how can we deal with the situation in ways that go beyond just the initial problem. We know that a lot of times, some of those questions that we're dealing with, some of those situations that we're having to address are symptoms of bigger things that are impacting the life of the church. So we're invited then, whenever something comes up, to either go to it in a technical or an adaptive way. Now, granted, we know that certain situations require an immediate attention. I mean, if the HVAC system is broken, we know that we immediately need to fix it. That's not the issue. But as we look at that initial solution or response, what is the bigger picture? What can we learn and what can we lean into as we consider just these many questions? We at the church, we talk about what it means to be both. We talk about what it means to look at questions from a different perspective, and I want to talk to you briefly about the power of the question. The power of the question. And in our transformational services that we offer through DCF, we talk about, when we're in conversation with churches, we talk about the phrase, change the question, change the church. Change the question, change the church. A lot of times, it's not the question is being asked, it's how is the question being asked? And a lot of times, some of our questions are just yes or no questions, really closed questions. But when we are able to reformulate our questions with clarity of what we hope to achieve, okay, but to achieve it from a sense of growth and a sense of possibilities, I think it opens us up to new ways of seeing how things can be done, of reimagining how we do things, especially in our church life. So when we talk about the question of how do we add more people, what if we flip that question to ask ourselves, how do we offer relevant ministries that people want to be a part of? You know, it should come as no surprise, people don't want to join anything today. When you look at clubs, when you look at social organizations, when you look at trade organizations, even unions, I mean, people are eschewing the concept of membership. People don't want to become members, okay? And we, as a church, struggle with that because the membership concept is a culture that we have constantly lived in for as long as we can remember, okay? But people don't want to join. So what if the question then became, how do we become a place of ministry? How do we offer ministry opportunities that people want to be a part of? Okay, so this opens the possibility for people to find their way into our faith community, attracted, compelled by the possibilities of being able to serve, of being able to do something relevant. At the end of the day, people will become part of an organization that allows them to be relevant, that allows them to feel like their actions are resulting in positive effects for others, okay? So what if then our question became, how do we become a place where people want to be, okay? And granted, maybe not everybody will become a, quote, permanent fixture, a permanent part of our church or our group, but at least they will be there present. So when we talk about the financial aspect, which is so important, how about if we ask ourselves, how do we leverage our resources so we are able to offer transformative ministries to our communities? So, you know, you probably have heard, God in his grace, everything that we need, God has already provided. All the resources we need are already here. And it kind of reminds me of that stone soup story, you know? And there might be many variations of it, but the truth is that a lot of times we just need to take a very objective look at our resources and ask ourselves, where is our money? Sometimes it's locked up, allocated to specific projects that are probably no longer relevant. Sometimes it's just our budget has mandated some specific usage that probably is no longer really effective for what the church is wanting to do. We know that sometimes there are monies that have been, or funds that have been created for specific purposes that are no longer there. So how do we begin to look at our resources, and how do we maybe reallocate, or how do we create new funds of new sourcing funds that will allow us to offer ministry into the community? And yes, I hope you're seeing a pattern here, because if the idea of being a change agent into the community, of offering relevant ministry, of really having a calming, soothing presence in the community, that's what needs to really guide the context and the focus of the question. Growth, money will come as consequences of a church who is clear in their vision, who is clear in their methodology to be the hands and feet of Christ. And the third question, which might occupy a little bit more of our time together, is when we talk about what do we do with our building, okay? How about if we ask ourselves, can we reimagine our meeting spaces so that they are conduits and not the focus of our ministry? Our budget is a real narrative of who we are as a church. When we look at our budgets, we're basically seeing a reflection of who we are as a church. A budget tells us what we value. Our budget tells us what we prioritize. Our budget tells us what it is that we are engaged or committed to. Now, this might be a blanket statement, and some of you might say, whoa. Because on the other hand, we realize that a lot of times when we look at our budgets, we see that they're skewed towards one place or the other, much to our chagrin or much to our despair, right? And one of the big things, usually a lot of budgets, when we look at them, that money allocated to building maintenance is really high. It's really high and sometimes sucks away from any kind of outreach, of any kind of ministry to the community, probably impacts the salaries or the monies that we can pay for staff, okay? But if we could reimagine our meeting spaces, it would almost be a trickle effect that would also then empower us to be able to do new things that could invite people to be part of our community, new things that could allow us to be more plentiful in how we allocate our resources so we can do ministry. Now, there is a clear relationship between the congregational life cycle, the building life cycle, and the financial life cycle of a church, okay? Probably you are familiar with the congregational life cycle, right? The bell curve, and we're going to look at that in a moment. But we at Disciples Church Extension Fund have talked about how there are three distinct elements when we look at a church, right? And the three of them have their definite cycles. The congregational life cycle, which speaks to the people, the building life cycle, which speaks to, of course, our physical facilities, and then the financial life cycle, which speaks to all of our resources. Now, understanding all three of the cycles and being keenly aware of where the congregation finds itself in these cycles will allow the church to live and to plan in a proactive model of ministry that will ensure sustainability, relevance, and impact in their ministry, both internal, both to the people in the church, as well as external, to the community that we've been called to serve, okay? So let me use this diagram. And again, although we talk about building, life, and resources, I want to kind of concentrate more on the building, but just to see how it comes together. So when you look at the bell curve, right, we have kind of imposed on it a vertical line that speaks to vitality and a horizontal line that speaks to sustainability, okay? So when you impose this on the bell curve, you basically create these 4 quadrants, okay? And some of you might be familiar with this. So when we talk about first quadrant, okay, we talk about those initial years of the church. And, you know, no matter how old your church might be, there was a time when you were a new church, okay? Now, for some, it might have been so long ago that institutional memory of those exciting first years might have been lost or whatever, but there was a time when we were all new churches, okay? And this is a time when people were starting to come together. There was probably a compelling vision. There was a sense of excitement at the newness that this project was offering. But one of the big things is that probably that church started its life not in a building that they owned. So maybe they were renting. Maybe they were nesting at another congregation. Maybe they were, I don't know, renting space in a movie theater or YMCA, or why not? We have so many of those in a bar, okay? But the little financial resources and human resources that the church might have had were all directed to, first of all, bonding together as a faith community, right? A new faith community, but also beginning to reach out into the community, maybe in a way that was almost organic, okay? In an almost organic sense. Free of the burden of a building that had already needs and demands. And this is one of the big things. A lot of times we struggle with saying, well, you know, one way to bless a new church is to give them this old church building that's been closed for 30, 40 years. We need to be careful, because in the first quadrant of the church is still solidifying its identity, solidifying its foundational, its core members, okay? So this is a time of a lot of excitement, a lot of passion, okay? Maybe, you know, it's one of these shooting everywhere and hitting not every place, but it's an exciting time in the life of the church. And for those of you who probably have been church planters or been part of a new church plant, you know what I'm talking about, okay? But it's also a time of that freedom, that fluidity, that flexibility, because you're not encumbered by the debt of a mortgage or a rent that's so high. Actually, for a moment also the rent becomes too much in a leased space, you just kind of make plans and are able to move on to somewhere else, okay? But As time goes on and the church begins to acquire some maturity, okay, the church then moves into the second quadrant of both the congregational as well as the building and financial life cycles, okay? So here in the second quadrant, the church has begun to mature probably in its program. The church has already begun to experience maybe its first losses of people who were part of the initial church group, okay? Programs are now being formalized. Probably the first documents of incorporation of administration have already made their way into it. If the church was able to acquire a first unit in their first quadrant of church life, probably this is a time when they are maybe expanding or looking at renovations or whatever. A lot of churches in this second quadrant is when they acquire their first unit. But the thing is, it's also moving into a different experience of sustainability and vitality. The group tends to be larger. The finances tend to be a little bit more generous. Okay, so the church is able to begin to fund ministry outreach, to get involved in, I don't know, local as well as global initiatives, et cetera, okay? There still is a vision, there still is energy, there's still people. But of course, time goes on and the church continues to mature. The church continues to experience change. The church continues to grow in many ways. And inevitably, the church then comes to a place of plateau, okay? This is a place where all churches, well, prayerfully all churches at one time or another reach, because it's a place of maturity. It's kind of that cusp place. You know, these are our best years. Sometimes people look back and say, oh yeah, those were our glory years, okay? But it's that time when there's enough maturity. Maybe if we think about in human cycle, maybe it's that time when, you know, in your late 30s, early 40s, I don't know, but you know, you feel like there's a lot that's been accomplished. There's still a couple of things on the horizon, but it's all good, okay? It's a plateau time. But then inevitably, the church then enters into a time of decline, okay? A time of decline because this is just a natural progression of an organic body such as the church, okay? And we enter into the third quadrant. The third quadrant is a time of what we call the comfort church or the tradition church. Traditions are firmly ensconced, ways of doing things. There's history, there's you know, things that have happened. So people, and then you have your insiders who are aware of all that stuff. You start losing more people because people age out, people move away. You have people who come in new. And in some cases, it almost becomes this, you know, the original church and the newcomers. And sometimes people are referred to as newcomers, although they've been 15, 20 years in the church. But something very important starts happening in this third quadrant. And it's when you look at your budget, okay, your allocations for building maintenance have begun to increase exponentially. Now, your income probably has not increased at that same rate. So what's starting to happen is monies are being drawn away from probably your ministries, your outreach, your anything that has to do with internal work with your church. Certainly, a lot of times that budget for our staff is impacted, okay? And we begin to feel like the money mostly is going into maintaining our buildings. This kind of squeezes out the joy of a lot of people, okay? And it kind of puts people into a bit of a concern, and we kind of start looking at things from a model of scarcity, and all of a sudden questions about our long-term sustainability are there. Interestingly enough, a lot of churches that find themselves in this quadrant still have enough vitality and sustainability, which kind of allows them to sort of put off the questions about how do we address this? All churches will eventually go into and experience the fourth quadrant, okay? And again, this is just a natural progression. Somehow people out there think that if you're a fourth quadrant church, that means that the nails on the coffin are starting to be pounded in. And that's not necessarily true. Okay, a church in the fourth quadrant is not a death toll. A church in the fourth quadrant is a church that needs to sit down and really discern profoundly what next steps might be. Okay, this is a church that really needs some attention because fourth quadrant churches, as you might see, are below the sustainability line and below the vitality line. So it's not a fun place to be a lot of times, okay? There are people there, people still love the church and things are happening, but there is this kind of dark cloud over the church that reminds them that things are not at their best. Things are not how they should be. Vision probably has been lost. A lot of people have left. A lot of programs have been canceled for lack of finances. Others because they're no longer relevant. And it seems like the church is more inward focused than outward focused, okay, than it ever had been before. But when we look at the budget, again, it's another tale of a church in the fourth quadrant. Probably what we'll see is that the majority of our limited resources are going into building maintenance. The majority of our resources are going to address maybe really expensive items that we had been kind of ignoring, hoping, praying. Probably over the years, we had dealt with it in a very technical aspect. And now the picture is much dreader. Okay, so we need to look at what do we do. So you look at the budget, probably we have at expense of letting go our pastoral staff, or now our pastor is just a part-timer. So that obviously impacts many of the programs. Some of the ministries are no longer functioning because there's no funding. Probably some of the outreach into the community is now funded by other sources, or the church has just stopped doing it. So it's a very dismal time, okay? And it's a time when a lot of churches just kind of go into that mode of, this is it, the end of the road. Now, let me tell you, there's the congregational life cycle speaks of a time when there comes death, okay, when there comes an end to visible ministries. And the truth is, churches die. I mean, we have churches that have been around for 200-300 years. In Europe, churches have been around for, gosh, hundreds and hundreds of years. But there are churches that die. Think about it. None of the churches that the Apostle Paul started in his church planting era are around today. Now, we stand on the shoulders of those saints of before times, but the physical presence of that church is no longer around. So yeah, there are churches that in this fourth quadrant will need to close, and there is a way to close with dignity, and there's a way to leverage your resources to bless other ministries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is also a time that offers us the opportunity to experience renewal, to experience transformation. We are the people of the resurrection story. So we need to learn to apply that to our own journey, right, as believers. So this is a time that offers us the opportunity for us to begin to ask. So there are several questions that in this time we need to wrestle with. Now, hear me. Ideally, we have started wrestling with these questions already in the third quadrant of our church. It's a little bit easier to think about these difficult things when things are still kind of not as critical, right? But fourth quadrant, now we kind of have the decisions and the conversations need to be had if we are to experience new life. I think one of the most crucial conversations we need to have is a clear understanding of what is the purpose of our church buildings. Or put another way, what is our theology of the building? What is our theology of the building? Unfortunately, when we look through, and we hear people, sometimes our theology of the building has become that the building is a sacred space, right? When we go to scripture and we start in the Old Testament and we look at the narratives of the tabernacle, right, of the tent that was a sanctuary in the Exodus stories, we see that church or the temple or that becomes the place where people experience God. You might remember in Exodus and in the books of Torah, it talks about the people were there and the people would look at that tent that had been prepared, and the Shekinah of Yahweh would come on, and there would be a cloud surrounding them. People saw, and the people knew that God was there. Okay, so the presence of the God was there. Of course, we know that later with the construction of the temple and the veil that was, that was put through, so God was separated from the people. But then, Christ's sacrifice on the cross, that veil is torn apart, and the people are invited to enter into God's presence. So that's where we as a church stand now, right? When we are called into this building, it's a place where we experience God. But it's also that place where we remember that God is with us on our journey, right? Because we are sojourners in this life. So what is our theology of the building? Because is it that our understanding that this building is a conduit? Because scripture is clear. God does not inhabit structures made by men. We are the living temples. We are those places where God has poured God's Spirit into each one of us. So the church is present anytime the believers congregate, be it in the park, be it in the sanctuary, the building that we call our church, be it at the bar before the bar opens or after the bar has closed. That is what makes that place holy. That's why when we talk about holy spaces, we're talking about the places that basically offer a roof over the head for the church. So this presents several challenges, okay? So you remember the bell curve, right? The congregational life cycle, we talked about vitality and sustainability. So those two elements together, when they're functioning at their best, we say that those are healthy churches, okay? We're not necessarily talking about wealthy churches. We're not talking necessarily about mega churches. We're talking about churches that are able to operate out of a sense of abundance, that experience vitality, that experience sustainability, okay? Now, when we look at these churches, again, regardless of size, regardless of finances, these churches see themselves as tents. And we kind of used that idea from the Old Testament, right? So they see themselves as this flexible, mobile, fluid structure, okay, that is more of a housing for, okay? Healthy churches are churches that are on the constant move, okay? So these are churches that continuously are remodeling, renovating, in some cases relocating, okay? And it's something that's constant, but it's to facilitate ministry. Again, I hope I hear we're picking up again on the whole thing about ministry, because ultimately that's what this is all about, okay? So they're constantly asking themselves, what needs to happen next? A couple of, not too long ago, I heard a pastor who was saying that they had written into their administrative guides and for building usage that once a year, every year, they'll go in and they will move everything around. So they will, put artwork on different places. They will move the banners, change the banners. The idea is to give the church a sense of we are constantly on the move. Of course, this is just not something internal, because they're also a church that are impacting the community in really powerful ways. But it's that idea that something new is always happening, okay? I don't want to pull numbers out, but Rick Warren's Saddleback Church in California, in the first 15 years of his life, I think they switched campuses more than 40 times, okay? And those might be kind of numbers, but so they were constantly moving, and people were so fearful, oh, if we move, we're going to lose people. Well, if you move into the right place, you will gain people. So relocation, which is one of the many aspects that a healthy church might be willing to consider, is not necessarily a death toll, but rather it's an invitation to continue to seek relevance. Why? Because healthy churches are relevant and are fully present in their communities, okay? Sometimes some of our churches, and I'm not talking about disciple churches, I'm talking about this church buildings, sometimes they just send these messages, or the way people drive in and drive out of the church, or those huge fences around the church. They just send this message, okay, that speaks to lack of relevance and lack of presence in the community. So if we go back to the power of the question, okay, and we're talking about how in our wherever quadrant we might be, there are questions that we need to wrestle with. Okay. And because we're talking about holy spaces, we're talking about that place which kind of offers us a gathering place. How can our buildings be tools for ministry? Okay. How can our buildings be a tool for ministry? In other words, how can they be conduits for that which we feel that God has called us to do? How can our buildings serve the needs of the community? Okay. how can we be adaptable, flexible, so that we are able to respond to what the community needs in different moments, okay? In different moments. And and it's, I mean, sometimes we just want to kind of break our heads coming up with this, but sometimes it's just about having a bathroom with a shower, okay? But it's just, how can we be sure that the way we are set up, okay, allows us to be present for the community in its needs? And then, how can the building be a place to show God's love and care for all? And again, sometimes it's the most basic things. Sometimes it's all about accessibility. It's all about hospitality. It's all about just projecting a sense of you are welcome here. Okay. But these are questions that sometimes we just kind of brush off. But then there are also other questions which has to do with our core identity, with our understanding of our call to be church. And I guess one of the most powerful questions we need to struggle with is, what is God calling your congregation to do? What is our God-given purpose? What is that which in God's infinite wisdom, God saw this place where we would be and we would make a difference? And to be able to answer that question in a powerful, ministry-focused way, there are other questions that we need to ask ourselves as part of that. For example, what are the needs of our neighbors? A lot of times churches serve their communities out of assumptions. They think they know, and sometimes the assumptions are incorrect. Sometimes churches have been operating ministries for years based on needs that were present in the community at that time. But have we taken the time to kind of update it and figure out, fact check, to know if that which we are doing still continues to address a need in the community, or have the needs changed and therefore this ministry is no longer needed in the community? And then, in an honest self-perception, what can we offer our neighbors? Because again, we have what we have in terms of our people, in terms of our finances, in terms of our physical facilities, okay? We can't be everything to everybody. And sometimes the way that we can really serve God and serve our community is to find that niche, find that place where we can be our best at, okay? So the whole idea is, what can we offer? What are the passions? What are the gifts? What are the talents of our people? Or what is it that we can offer so that even people in the community can come and feel that they can be part of what this church has to offer, regardless of whether they see this as their home church, okay? That's not what this is about. It's about, how can we be a place that facilitates ministry for everybody who wants to make a difference in our communities? But alongside that, there's the pragmatic side of the entire conversation. There are things that we need to consider. One of the big things is location. And I'm not talking from that real estate perspective, but the question is, are we where we need to be? Okay. And it's just not our physical location. A lot of times churches are, based in places where they were planted to serve that community that was there. But, communities shift, communities change, demographics change. So are we at the place that we need to be so we can offer the ministry that we are already offering? Okay. Or then the question is, are we aware of the needs that are now in this community that we can offer from this place that we're at? And of course, we could continue to ask many questions and unpack that, but our location, okay, are we at where we need to be at? And that's a question that can be answered in so many ways, but it's all about relevance and presence in community. The second question, and that was a question that we raised right from the beginning of this presentation, it's what do we do with our building? Well, the first thing we need to know is, what is it about our building? What are our building conditions? We need to be able to look at our building from a very objective perspective. How old is our building? What is the condition of our building? What are the maintenance issues in our building? Okay. What is the message that our building sends when people drive by? Okay. All that are things that we need to consider. Is it accessible? What could we do? I mean, and do we have the fluidity or the capacity to modify, to remodel, at cost that is reasonable. Okay, what are the building conditions? The other element is size and usage. Okay, we know today we have a lot of churches that, with a sanctuary that can fit 200-300, and they gather 40 or 50. Let's suspend judgment. It's not about who did what and why is the church small, but the truth of the matter is, 50, 60 people don't need a sanctuary that sits 400 or 500. In fact, it can be pretty uncomfortable, and let's not even talk about the cost of maintaining that place open. One time I saw a drawing in a book. It's two birds on a telephone line, and they're staring at this huge church. And one bird says to the other, "Hey, what a great nest." And the other bird replies, "Yeah, it's a shame they only use it 2 hours a week." So size and usage, when we look at our facilities, okay, are they adequate? When we look at our parking, parking for 50 cars, we only park 10. When we look at that Christian education wing, 2 stories, 10 rooms, and we only have one Sunday school class that meets in the sanctuary. So, size and usage. How much of our building is used for ministry? Have we become landlords and practically all the space is just rented out? How is that ministry? Okay. In some places and some churches, I know that, yeah, they're rented out, but the church has a real close working relationship with those groups that are renting from them. So that's ministry. But, and others, it's just, we rent that and we don't even know what they look like or where they come, but, so size and usage. And then, of course, we have to sit down and be honest about, the financial considerations. Okay. Again, what does our budget tell us? Where are we spending our money? What are we doing with our resources? And then those honest conversations about, where are we as far as, in our financial panorama. In Fourth Quadrant, a lot of churches find themselves, burning through the resources that were the result of the generosity of the saints that came before them. Okay, when they look at their balance sheet, they see, constant decline. When every Sunday, what comes in through tithes and offerings, and special gifts versus, the expenses of the week, we're at deficit. So that's a reality. And and again, it's not about blame. It's about, this is where we are right now. Okay. And all that needs to be part of a really honest conversation. Now, I want you to know, it's not all bad. This is not the end of the road, no matter how depressed you might feel. That whole Chicken Little thing, the sky is falling. If we are believers, the sky is never falling, because we serve a God of new beginnings. We serve a God of opportunities. And that God has walked with your congregation from even before the church started meeting, okay? But God promises a new future. There's that Jeremiah passage, which, we need to remind ourselves constantly, there is a future. God has plans for us, but it also involves us being willing to continue on that journey. So we are talking about the need to make bold decisions and to take risks. And these bold decisions need to come out of a clear discernment, a time of wrestling with these realities, and to be willing to step out in faith. Nothing is guaranteed. We don't have the assurance of the, quote, right answers. But one thing is sure, that we are willing to take risks. God will walk with us. And even if what we do doesn't really work out, there's a learning that we can take away from that, and we can try again, and God will prosper, because we have to believe that our work in the Lord is never in vain. There is always fruit, even if we don't see it. So as we are kind of bringing this to a conclusion, you are out there, and I want to challenge you. We need to allow ourselves to be creative. We need to allow ourselves to think outside of the box. We need to be willing to bring some of those voices from the margins, some of those people from our church who are kind of out on the outside saying, this isn't working, and to be able to sit together and to dream God's big dreams. We talk about letting go and letting God, right? And the idea is we need to be willing to let go if we are to let come, to receive that which God wants us to receive as the conduits for that ministry. And my brother, my sister, a lot of times it means putting it all on the altar. Our programs, how we manage our finances, our buildings, everything on the counter to really discern, what do we need to let go of? What do we need to reimagine? What do we need to change? Okay, so we can be those people of the resurrection stories. Habakkuk 2:2, I think just illustrates in a very powerful way. God is the vision giver. And our churches need people who are willing to stand in that gap, to be the receptors of the vision, to dream God's big dreams for our churches, for our communities. But then there's also the need to be able to articulate it clearly. At DCEF, we call those future stories. A clear sense of where we would be in the future if we allowed ourselves to believe God and to discern what needs to be done and to walk in faith, okay? But then it talks about then once you've written it down, give it to the people. Our people need to understand that we are all called to be ministers. Not all of us are called to be pastors, but part of the work of the church is to equip the saints for all good works. So we need to own our visions. We need to own the vision of our church. We as members of our local faith communities, we need to embrace and ask ourselves, what is my part in this running with the vision, in this implementation of the vision? It can happen. We know of so many churches out there who have taken these bold steps and have embraced new visions and are willing and are seeing how new life is bursting forth. So it all starts with an honest assessment of what you value as a church. And again, your budget can help in that conversation. What you feel called to do as Christ followers. And again, we are people who speak of the priesthood of all believers. So we need to understand that the church, we are called. It's not just about our pastor. It's not just about our paid staff. It's about what each and every one of us is called to do as followers of Christ, so that we can be the hands and feet of Christ, and we can be those change agents that this world so desperately needs. So here at Disciples Church Extension Fund, we are here to accompany you in these discernment processes about next steps. We believe that difficult times, changing times like these invite us to reimagine every aspect of church. But one of the aspects we need to reimagine is our holy spaces. If we are to offer those powerful ministries, if we are to offer those life-changing experiences, if we are to be change agents in our communities, we really need to look at the big picture. So we'd love to have more conversation with you. I understand that on the 27th, we will have a session for questions and answers based on this presentation. I would invite you to join in on that day. But meanwhile, my contact information is down there on the screen, right? And my cell phone number. And also you can reach out at info@Disciples Church Extension Fund, and we would love to have that conversation with you. So thank you for your time. May God bless you. And we hope to have further conversation later on.